June 1943, somewhere deep in the American South, a long train rolled through the darkness carrying thousands of German prisoners captured in North Africa. The men had boarded expecting the same conditions they had known in Europe: boxcars, straw on the floor, little water, endless discomfort. Instead, they found themselves seated in upholstered Pullman coaches with clean windows and electric lights that glowed overhead. Through those windows, they saw something that began to gnaw at their certainty more deeply than defeat on the battlefield ever could. Out across the flat lands of Virginia and Tennessee, every farmhouse, every barn, every small town shimmered with light. Not the dim yellow glow of a lantern, but brilliant electric bulbs shining in clusters that stretched to the horizon. For men who had lived under blackout orders for years, who had walked streets of Hamburg and Berlin in absolute darkness since 1940, the sight was like looking at another planet. It was not a city center, not Berlin or Paris, but simple rural America, and it glowed brighter than their greatest metropolises. Some of the prisoners muttered to one another that this was an illusion staged for their arrival, some kind of Allied trick to demoralize them. Others pressed their faces to the glass, counting the street lamps, and lit windows until the numbers overwhelmed their ability to track. How could a nation at war afford such waste? How could they leave lights burning in barns and shops while devoting resources to armies on two oceans? In Germany, even hospitals operated under blackout curtains, doctors stitching wounds by flashlight during air raids. Here in the United States, children were doing homework under electric lamps in farmhouses at midnight while trains of enemy soldiers rumbled by. The atmosphere in the carriage grew heavy. Men who had carried themselves with pride in the Desert War, who had believed themselves superior to any adversary, sat in silence as the endless constellation of light rolled past. One young corporal whispered to his comrade that he had seen more electricity in a single American village than in his entire district in Bavaria. A lieutenant, once confident in Nazi propaganda about American weakness, clenched his jaw as he realized that what lay outside was not propaganda at all. It was reality, and it was far beyond what the Reich could produce even in peacetime. As the train thundered westward, the prisoners caught sight of factories glowing against the night sky, their windows lit with activity, their parking lots filled with civilian automobiles. To men raised in a nation where only party officials and industrial elites owned cars, it seemed impossible that ordinary workers could drive to their jobs in such numbers. Each flash of light from those windows carried a psychological weight heavier than artillery. It was not only proof of industrial power, it was proof of abundance, proof that America could fight a global war and still leave its countryside illuminated as if peace had never ended. The contrast to their homeland was unbearable. Germany had rationed coal, rationed gas, rationed food. They had lived by candlelight and kerosene when supplies allowed. Now, through the glass of a prisoner train, they saw a nation that treated electricity as casually as water, pouring it across the land without concern. Some of the men turned away, unable to watch, yet the light crept in regardless, filling the carriage, burning into their memory. It was their first true encounter with the scale of American industry, and though not a shot was fired, it felt like a battle already lost. The night of their arrival was only the beginning. When dawn broke, and the prisoners could finally see the countryside in daylight, the scale of America's transformation became even more difficult to comprehend. Stretching away from the tracks were farms that seemed impossibly vast, fields divided into neat squares, each dotted with machinery gleaming in the morning sunday. Most shocking of all was that every farmstead, no matter how small, had its own power lines strung across wooden poles, carrying electricity directly into barns, kitchens, and workshops. In Germany, even before the war, electrification in rural areas had reached barely 1 out of 5 farms. In 1943 America, more than 9 out of 10 were electrified. For men who had grown up lighting stables with oil lamps, this was not progress, it was another universe. Some of the prisoners tried to explain it away. Perhaps the Americans had concentrated resources near the railroad line to impress them. But the train kept rolling, mile after mile, hour after hour, and the evidence never ended. Every town passed in the night had been ablaze with lights, and in daylight the prisoners saw the infrastructure that made it possible. Substations, power plants, lines stretching to the horizon, all feeding energy into homes and factories without pause. Germany's leadership had ordered blackouts since 1940, plunging entire cities into darkness to confuse bombers, and still the RAF had found their targets. Here, while fighting on two oceans, America lit up its countryside without fear. The statistics were merciless. In 1940, the United States had already produced 150 billion kilowatt-hours of electricity, and by 1945, that figure would more than double to over 300 billion. Germany in the same period managed only around 40 billion. The numbers were so large that prisoners struggled to grasp them. To men whose families cooked on coal stoves and who had rationed heating to a few hours a day, the idea of a nation generating 8 times their output was beyond imagination. It was not just that America had more electricity, it was that the country consumed it without hesitation, running lights in empty buildings, powering machines day and night, wasting energy in ways that would have been criminal in the Reich. At one stop, the train paused beside a small freight yard. The prisoners watched as American railway workers operated mechanized coal loaders and electric pumps that completed in 30 minutes what German crews required hours to finish. One prisoner scribbled in his diary that the yard seemed to consume more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. Another noted the casual wealth of the workers themselves, men in clean boots, smoking cigarettes, drinking Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossing the half-finished remains into bins as if supply was endless. The message could not be clearer. This was not a staged performance. This was normal life in America. The emotional effect on the Germans was profound. They had been taught that the United States was a fractured society, weak and decadent, unable to sustain prolonged conflict. Now they sat as captives on a train and saw with their own eyes that even the smallest American town possessed more light, more power, more comfort than their homeland's proudest cities. It was not military defeat alone that crushed their morale. It was the recognition that the industrial base of America existed on a scale so far beyond their own that no amount of courage or strategy could bridge the gap. In the glow of ordinary light bulbs and the hum of distant generators, they began to understand that the war they were fighting was unwinnable. The deeper the train pushed into the American heartland, the more painful the comparisons became. In Germany, entire cities rationed power to a few hours a day, hospitals operated under blackout curtains, and families boiled water over coal stoves that often went cold for lack of fuel. The Reich had been forced to divert electricity to its few remaining factories, producing U-boats, tanks, and aircraft, leaving civilians in darkness. The prisoners knew these hardships well. Letters from home spoke of children doing homework by candlelight and families shivering through winter nights. Yet here, in the very nation they had been told was decadent and collapsing, the evidence of excess surrounded them in every direction. By 1943, the United States consumed more electricity than the rest of the world combined. Production had soared from 150 billion kilowatt-hours in 1940 to over 300 billion by 1945, a six-fold increase in only 15 years from pre-Depression levels. The Tennessee Valley Authority alone generated more power than all of occupied France. One hydroelectric dam on the Columbia River produced more electricity than entire German provinces. To men raised in a society where power lines stopped at the city limits, the scale was incomprehensible. The numbers confirmed what their eyes had already told them. America was not just illuminated, it was electrified to its bones. The comparison with Germany's figures was brutal. German production in 1943 amounted to roughly 40 billion kilowatt-hours, barely 1/10 of the American figure. And even that meager output was increasingly unreliable. Allied bombing raids severed transmission lines, destroyed substations, and cut coal supplies feeding the power plants. Civilian consumption fell to emergency levels, factories suffered rolling outages, and entire regions were darkened to preserve a few kilowatts for armaments production. The Reich had to decide whether to power a tank factory or keep a city warm. In America, Both were done without hesitation, and still the country had power to spare. Prisoners whispered comparisons that bordered on the absurd. A single American aluminum plant in Tennessee consumed more electricity than Munich. The Ford River Rouge complex in Detroit used more kilowatts per day than Hamburg. The lights they had seen burning in farmhouses through the night were not luxuries. They were a byproduct of a system so vast that even waste was magnificent. In Germany, men would have been jailed for leaving a lamp lit in an empty room. In America, barns glowed with floodlights, though the animals inside slept. The prisoners tried to reconcile these images with the slogans they had repeated for years about German superiority. Each flicker of neon outside the train window tore another piece from their certainty. The shock was not only material, but psychological. In the Reich, light itself had become associated with danger. To show a candle in the wrong place at night was to risk a bomber's aim. Darkness was safety. Silence was survival. Now, in their captivity, they were confronted with a nation that could turn night into day without fear, a society so confident in its power that illumination was casual, effortless, and endless. They realized that American industrial supremacy was not just measured in tanks or planes, but in the unseen currents of electricity that powered every machine, every factory, every household. To fight such a nation was not merely difficult, it was impossible. As the train continued westward, the spectacle grew only more relentless. By day they had seen the farms, the power lines, the endless fields of grain. Now, as dusk fell again, their windows framed a new vision. Entire cities glowing on the horizon, factory districts blazing with thousands of lamps, smokestacks belching fire into the twilight sky. The prisoners pressed their faces against the glass, silent, each man struggling to process what passed before his eyes. In Germany, factories went dark the moment evening fell, their windows shrouded in blackout curtains, production slowed by power cuts, machinery halted during bombing raids. Here, the opposite was true. The prisoners saw American plants working 3 shifts without pause, parking lots filled with automobiles even at midnight, assembly lines running on electricity that seemed to have no end. To men who had fought in North Africa, where a single spare part often meant the difference between survival and defeat, the sight of warehouses stacked to their rafters with raw materials was incomprehensible. One lieutenant who had worked in the Ruhr before the war murmured that the single railway yard they stopped at in Kentucky seemed to consume more electricity in an hour than his entire district in Essen used in a day. Another, an engineer from Hamburg, scribbled in his diary that the mechanized coal loaders and automated pumps he saw along the tracks completed in minutes what would have taken his old factory crew hours. The scale was staggering, but what broke their confidence was not only the machinery, it was the casual way in which Americans treated it. Workers smoked cigarettes as they operated cranes, drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles, tossed the half-finished remains aside without thought. The abundance was so extreme, it bordered on mockery, though not intended as such. The train stops became chapters in a slow, brutal lesson. At Roanoke they watched electric water pumps fill locomotives with precision. At Louisville they passed the Rubbertown complex, 4 vast synthetic rubber plants built in only 18 months, producing hundreds of thousands of tons annually, 6 times Germany's best output in its peak year. Near Detroit, the prisoners glimpsed the colossal frame of Willow Run, the bomber factory that covered 3.5 million square feet. Through the windows they counted rows of B-24 Liberators in various stages of completion, each one more precisely built than anything they had ever seen at home. The statistics whispered among them were devastating. One factory in Michigan promised to produce a bomber every hour, while in Germany, entire aircraft industries struggled to build one per day. A single American synthetic rubber complex outproduced their nation's entire capacity. Grain elevators along the Mississippi held more food than all of Germany's annual harvest. What the prisoners witnessed from their train seats was not propaganda but fact, not rumor but reality, and it gnawed at their certainty with every mile. When the lights of Street Louis filled the horizon, brighter than anything they had imagined possible, one veteran of the Afrika Korps muttered under his breath that Germany had already lost. Another reminded him to stay silent, for fear that guards might overhear, but the thought was spreading among them all. No army, no matter how disciplined, could overcome such a reservoir of power. For the first time, defeat was not an abstract possibility. It was written in neon, in smokestacks, in the blinding glow of a continent that never slept. By the time the train neared the Midwest, the prisoners were already hollow-eyed from what they had seen. Yet the true heart of America's industrial engine was only now coming into view. Through the night sky, they glimpsed complexes that seemed to stretch for miles, entire landscapes converted into machinery and smoke. When the train slowed near Detroit, they could see the colossal bulk of the River Rouge plant on one side and the sprawling skeleton of Willow Run on the other. To German eyes accustomed to compact workshops and cramped facilities, these were not factories but cities devoted to production. At River Rouge, over 100,000 workers poured in and out of gates, each arriving in their own automobiles, each feeding a system that consumed 1.5 million kilowatt-hours of electricity every single day. That single plant used more energy than Hamburg in its entirety. Across the fields, Willow Run's endless roof concealed a mile-long assembly line where B-24 bombers were built in pieces by thousands of hands before emerging fully formed at the far end. The prisoners were told by their guards that soon this factory alone would produce one bomber every hour. They did not believe it at first, but even the sight of dozens of liberators in various stages of construction was enough to silence all doubt. The mathematics were merciless. Germany's entire aircraft industry at its peak managed fewer than 1,500 planes a month. By late 1943, America was producing more than that from a single region, with Willow Run climbing toward 400 bombers per month, Boeing turning out 16 flying fortresses daily in Seattle, and Douglas employing 160,000 workers across 9 plants. The Germans whispered to one another that this was not war production, but war annihilation. They had fought in North Africa, watching Luftwaffe units ration fuel and spare parts, but here they saw machines rolling off assembly lines with a rhythm more regular than church bells. Even more disturbing than the scale was the continuity. These plants did not pause at sunset, did not rest on Sundays, did not shut down for lack of coal or electricity. Floodlights illuminated entire complexes as if daylight had been permanently installed. Trains hauled in raw materials without interruption. At night, the parking lots remained filled, each car another reminder that even American workers lived at a standard beyond German officers. The Reich, once proud of its order and discipline, seemed primitive in comparison. Among the prisoners, silence became the default reaction. A sergeant from Bremen muttered that in Germany a factory might take months to resume output after a bombing raid, yet here Americans could lose an entire shift and still outproduce the Reich in a week. An engineer from Dusseldorf shook his head as he noted the precision of the sub-assembly lines, each component fitting perfectly with the next. In Germany, shortages had forced endless improvisation, mismatched parts, and constant delays. In America, the system ran like clockwork. The guards said little, but they did not need to. Every glowing window, every column of smoke, every whistle of a shift change spoke louder than propaganda. The Germans sat in their compartments, staring at the spectacle outside, and began to understand that their war was no longer being fought with divisions and tanks, but with factories, turbines, and furnaces that no military genius could overcome. For many of the prisoners, the journey became less about the miles covered and more about the growing weight inside their chests. Every factory seen through the train window, every illuminated street, every casual display of American plenty pressed on their minds with the same crushing force as an artillery barrage. By the time they reached the camps in Texas, humiliation had sunk deep into their bones. These men, veterans of the desert campaigns, had once believed themselves heirs to centuries of Prussian discipline and superiority. Yet sitting in American railcars, gazing at abundance far greater than any victory parade, they felt reduced to something small, insignificant, almost childish. In the barracks, conversations grew subdued. Some scribbled their thoughts into diaries, careful to hide them from fellow officers who still clung to the party line. One wrote, "We were stripped naked, not by defeat in Tunisia, but by the lights of America. Each lamp exposed our weakness. Another noted that his wife in Hamburg had written of boiling turnip peels for soup, while here, in captivity, he had eaten more meat in a week than his family saw in a year. The shame was unbearable. The prisoners had fought bravely, endured hardships, but no amount of personal courage could erase the gulf they now understood. They remembered Germany in blackout, streets silent and dark, hospitals cloaked, families huddled around weak candles. They contrasted it with the dazzling glow of towns in Kentucky and Ohio, where even barns shone with floodlights. The symbolism was inescapable. One nation retreating into darkness, the other striding confidently into endless light. A captain confessed to his bunkmates, "The true weapon of America is not its bombers or tanks. It is this electricity, industry, abundance. We were blind to it until it blinded us." The humiliation deepened as they reflected on their own propaganda. For years, they had been told America was weak, a mongrel nation of consumers without discipline. Now they had seen the truth, and it burned more deeply than any wound. Even their officers, who still barked about eventual German victory, could not erase the memory of Willow Run, stretching like a city under one roof, or the sight of workers throwing away cigarettes and food as if resources were infinite. The men understood instinctively that wars were no longer won by brilliant maneuvers or shock assaults. They were won by mathematics of production, by the ceaseless flow of raw materials transformed into weapons without end. Some tried to rationalize, to insist that America's abundance would collapse under its own weight, that the people lacked the spirit to endure. But their voices were weak, unconvincing, drowned out by the relentless images etched into every prisoner's mind. Silence followed these rationalizations, the kind of silence that speaks of doubt too heavy to confront openly. Pride had carried them into battle, but pride could not survive the spectacle of a single American factory producing more in a month than their homeland could in a year. It was not just defeat they felt. It was exposure. Their illusions lay shattered, their superiority revealed as delusion. And in the stillness of the Texas night, under electric lights that burned without interruption, they realized that their greatest humiliation was not captivity itself, but the knowledge that their nation had been outbuilt, outpowered, and outshone long before the first bomb had ever fallen on Berlin. In the weeks that followed, the silence inside the camps began to change. What had first been humiliation slowly turned into a grim kind of acknowledgement. The men no longer argued about whether America could maintain its war effort. They had seen enough to know the answer. Instead, they spoke in low voices about what this meant for Germany, for their families, for the war they had once believed winnable. The acknowledgement came not through propaganda, but through lived experience, repeated daily in the smallest details of camp life. Every morning the lights came on in their barracks without interruption, powered by a grid that never faltered. In Germany, entire districts lost electricity when bombers hit coal trains. Here, even enemy prisoners enjoyed steady current for cooking, heating, and water pumps. The numbers told a story too devastating to ignore. By 1943, the United States controlled nearly half of the world's industrial output and over 60% of its electricity. Its copper production alone supplied enough wiring to electrify every town they had passed on their journey, while Germany stripped occupied territories bare just to maintain minimum consumption. In conversations, the men compared what they saw to their own experiences. A farmer from Bavaria recalled how his village harvested wheat with horses and sickles, producing 30 bushels per acre on the best land. In Kansas, American farms averaged 60 bushels, powered by combines that covered fields faster than cavalry. An engineer whispered that one TVA dam generated more power than all of Saxony. A former Luftwaffe mechanic noted that American plants had produced hundreds of thousands of aircraft engines, while German factories, bombed and dispersed, produced barely a fraction. Each memory was a reminder that the war they had fought was measured not in battles, but in tonnage, kilowatts, and gallons. Most bitter of all was the realization that Germany's sacrifices had been in vain. Their people had endured rationing, cold, and hunger, believing that such discipline would yield eventual victory. Now they understood that while they measured fuel in liters and bread in grams, the Americans measured in millions of gallons and thousands of tons. The disparity was not temporary, it was structural, a gulf that no courage or ideology could bridge. When guards casually mentioned that America had built more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, the prisoners knew instinctively that such figures were not exaggerations. They had seen the assembly lines themselves, heard the shift whistles, counted the planes lined up like products in a showroom. One prisoner recorded in his diary, "We were told America was weak, divided, incapable of war. Now we see that their weakness was our fantasy. They can waste more than we can imagine possessing. They can burn what we would guard with our lives. Against this, our training and bravery mean nothing." Another wrote, "They do not just fight with soldiers, they fight with machines, with electricity, with oceans of resources. It is not an army we face, but a system greater than any nation we have known." This was the turning point, the moment when bitterness gave way to resignation. The Germans no longer spoke of counteroffensives or wonder weapons. Instead, they admitted to themselves that the Reich had gambled on a war it could never win. They had been sent to conquer, but their defeat had been sealed the moment America's factories roared to life. What they had witnessed, barns with lights burning all night, factories producing around the clock, rail yards mechanized beyond their comprehension, was not just abundance. It was proof that the war was decided not on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets of industry and the steady hum of turbines. Christmas of 1943 arrived, and with it came the final blow to the illusions the prisoners had carried across the Atlantic. In Germany, their families were rationing every crumb, stretching turnips into bread, boiling ersatz coffee made from acorns, and shivering through blacked-out nights in bomb-scarred apartments. Here, in the middle of Texas, enemy soldiers sat down to a holiday feast under electric lights that glowed as bright as day. The camp mess hall had been decorated with garlands, the ovens produced turkey and ham, and trays of vegetables, potatoes, pies, and ice cream were passed down long tables. Prisoners who had not tasted such food in years found themselves eating until they were sick. For many, the abundance was harder to endure than hunger. It mocked their memories of home, where wives and children lined up for hours in the cold to receive a handful of rations. A Feldwebel from Hamburg whispered to his comrades that his own children had not seen meat in months. Yet here he, their father and defeated soldier, consumed more in a single meal than his family would eat in a season. Some wept openly, not from joy but from the crushing realization that the enemy treated captives better than the Reich treated its own citizens. The feast was not extraordinary to the Americans. Guards explained that this was a normal Christmas dinner, served in homes across the nation. Every family, they said, sat down to a table filled with meat, vegetables, and sweets, illuminated by electric lights and warmed by central heating. The prisoners were stunned into silence. What they experienced as a miracle was nothing more than the ordinary rhythm of American life. Outside the mess hall, floodlights illuminated the camp yard, banishing every shadow. The Germans thought back to their blacked-out cities, where even a cigarette glow could invite death from the sky. Here, light was not a danger but a comfort, turned on without hesitation. The symbolism was unmistakable. America embraced brightness, while Germany retreated into darkness. In that moment, the prisoners understood fully what the war had become. It was not a contest of divisions or tactics, not even of weapons, but of systems. The United States could feed its own people lavishly, arm its soldiers to the teeth, and still spare enough resources to make enemies live better in captivity than citizens lived at home in Germany. One prisoner wrote later, "We believed victory belonged to those willing to suffer most. Then we discovered America, which could win without suffering at all." The realization cut deeper than any defeat in battle. Their pride, as soldiers, collapsed beneath the evidence of abundance. They were no longer simply captured men. They were witnesses to the power of a nation that had made plenty itself into a weapon. And in the glow of Christmas lights, with the taste of turkey and pie still on their tongues, they conceded in their hearts what their leaders in Berlin refused to admit. The war was lost, not on the battlefield, but in the inexhaustible production lines and the effortless excess of America. Decades later, historians pieced together the words, diaries, and testimonies of the men who had crossed America in those prisoner trains. What emerged was not just the story of captivity, but of revelation. These soldiers had not been broken by interrogations or propaganda. They had been undone by what they saw with their own eyes. A nation whose strength was measured not in divisions, but in kilowatts, not in ideology, but in abundance. The flood of electricity across farm fields, the ceaseless rhythm of factories, the mountains of food, served even to enemies. All of it carried a message more devastating than bombs. The numbers confirmed what they had felt in their bones. By war's end, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 military aircraft compared to Germany's 95,000. American factories turned out 88,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, and more merchant shipping than all the Axis powers combined. Steel production in 1944 reached 89 million tons, while Germany struggled to reach 25. Even the most fanatical Nazi officers could not ignore such arithmetic. As one POW admitted after the war, "We fought bravely, but numbers do not lie. Their factories defeated us before their armies ever arrived." For the prisoners, the humiliation of those first encounters with American light never left them. A Bavarian farmer remembered watching combines harvest fields larger than his province and realizing that Germany could never match such scale. A former Luftwaffe officer recalled the endless rows of cars in Detroit, each worker driving to a job that built more machines in a week than the Reich could produce in months. Others remembered Christmas dinners under blazing electric bulbs, realizing that the enemy fed them better than their own families at home. These moments etched themselves into memory, carried back to a ruined Germany where families clutched the parcels their fathers mailed from captivity packages filled with chocolate, sugar, and canned goods bought with POW wages. Historians concluded that these experiences formed one of the most effective re-education campaigns in modern history, though it had not been designed as such. Abundance, not lectures, had broken the myth of Nazi superiority. Mercy, not cruelty, had revealed the emptiness of propaganda. America's greatest weapon had not been the B-29 or the Sherman tank, but the simple fact that it could provide light and food in quantities so vast that even its enemies lived better as captives than as free citizens in their own homeland. In later years, many of those former prisoners spoke of how their time in America shaped their vision of Germany's future. They had seen industrial democracy in action, where workers lived in dignity and production reached heights undreamed of under tyranny. They carried those lessons back to a nation in ruins, and in the 1,950 seconds, as West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, took shape, the influence of those memories was unmistakable. As one former POW testified in a 1970 interview, "We thought power came from conquest. America showed us it came from creation." The verdict of history was clear. The Reich had gambled on ideology, on willpower, on myths of racial superiority. America had relied on industry, electricity, and abundance. When the two collided, the outcome was never in doubt. The war was decided not only on battlefields, but in the glow of lights seen through train windows, in the steady hum of turbines, in the taste of food that seemed impossible to men raised on scarcity. Those POWs who once marched as conquerors returned home as witnesses, carrying the undeniable truth that the arsenal of democracy had buried tyranny beneath an avalanche of production.